morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Julia Vanderson. I'm the current chair of DocSIG, and I'm thrilled to have you all here with us. So for those of you who may not be familiar with DocSIG, DocSIG is a community with the American Marketing Associations dedicated to supporting doctoral students in marketing. Our mission is to provide resources, opportunities, and a network to help you navigate your PhD journey and succeed both academically and professionally. Today's webinar is a perfect example of that mission in action, as we focus on the unique challenges faced by many PhD students and even early assistant professors, as our RSVP sheet has revealed. We're extremely grateful to have such an engaged group of participants today. To make this webinar rewarding for everyone involved, we kindly ask you to switch on your cameras. Keep yourself muted and use your real name as your Zoom alias. Thank you for respecting that. We look forward to seeing all your pretty faces on your videos. A special thank you to Riley Krotz, who will be sharing his wealth of experience with us. Many of you may know Riley as a friendly face and DocSIG supporter at our AMA conferences, where he's always been generous with his time and wisdom. We're honored to have him here today to offer valuable insights on building corporate partnerships to conduct fieldwork, key strategies to help you bring your research project one contribution closer to publication. Without further ado, please welcome with us now Riley. And Riley, please bring it on. We're so happy to have you.
Well, thank you, Julia and Amir. I don't think I've ever had such a warm introduction. That's pretty cool. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Oh, it says sharing's not turned on. I sent a request. Okay, there we go. So let's see. All right, are you guys able to see everything? Okay, awesome. Yeah, I had such a wonderful introduction. My name, you guys are over here, so I'm going to be looking at this just so I can see some faces. My name's Riley Krotz. I am now an assistant professor of marketing at Florida State, and I'm so excited to be doing this because back when I was a PhD student, DocSIG did so much for me. I really have a sense of indebtedness to DocSIG. You guys featured me on your spotlight. I was fortunate to win the DocSIG Emerging Scholar Award. DocSIG as an organization, I truly attribute a whole bunch of my success to it, from the network that it has helped me build, to the skills, to the visibility. DocSIG is really an awesome organization, and so for those of you that aren't members, it's free to join. I highly recommend everyone to join. So a little bit about myself. I had an odd PhD journey. So I was a first-gen college student, and my family actually was rather against me going to college. In the U.S. system, we have to take the SAT or the ACT in order to get into college, and my parents wouldn't pay for my SAT. So I actually had to get a job at Burger King when I was in high school and save up enough money working after school to pay for my own SAT. And so I don't have it here, but I actually started at a local community college, and then I ended up going to a four-year university, the University of North Florida. That's where I met my first mentor, Greg Gunlock. He was at Notre Dame and then wanted to kind of have a better lifestyle, so he moved to the beach. He convinced me to go to the University of Tennessee. Highly recommend. For those of you who may be looking at PhDs or first placements, it was a wonderful place. Then I got my first faculty job at Texas Tech University, and then this is now my second year as an assistant professor at Florida State University. So you can kind of see I went full circle, and now I kicked my parents out. They're downstairs. They came to visit for the Thanksgiving holiday. So before we kind of get into the really nitty-gritty, for those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, my research primarily focuses on three domains: blood donations, and then I also do some work on public policy, as well as the organizational front lines. So the point of contact between an organization and its customer, whether it be the employee itself or touch points, which I'll talk about here shortly. But then really within blood donations, I focus on three areas. So the donor level, how do you get individuals to donate? What is their experience like donating? Then at the employee level, the phlebotomists themselves, getting a needle inserted into a donor's arm is a very unique experience. And so I do a lot of work in that area as well. And then the drive level, kind of the more high level strategy, where should you place the vans? How should you market those drives? And what are some strategies to get donors in and out of the door and then convert them from one-time donors into repeat donors? And as of Wednesday, there were 65 pre-submitted questions. So I kind of was overwhelmed, and I went through and I kind of redid my whole presentation based on this. So the goal is to hopefully answer a lot of the questions in the presentation itself, but if there are any questions, we'll have a good chunk of time at the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any specific questions that you have, because really the goal of this is you came in here with your own ideas of what you wanted to get out of it, and so my goal is to make sure that you get out of it what you want. So if there's anything that I miss, I'm happy to answer any questions. So I kind of segmented the presentation into kind of 4 key areas based on the question. There were a lot of questions on kind of how do you find companies to work with to begin with? And once you identify a company, how do you get them to want to work with you? Or even how do you find an idea that a company might want to work with you to begin with? And so I do a lot of work with managers, especially the CEO level, and also public policymakers. And so what do managers and public policymakers care about? If the goal is to actually forge a research partnership. And that's this idea of relevance. And so if managers or policymakers care about relevance, we as researchers also need to care about relevance for our research questions. Because if there isn't an alignment between what the organization that you're wanting to partner with wants to do and what you want to do, there's no way that you guys are going to come to an agreement on how to work together. So I have a few slides on what is relevance when it comes to managerial or public policymaker mindsets, and then how can we incorporate that into our own research endeavors. So what is relevant research? Well, it's research that addresses practical, real-world questions. And so working with doc students, and I'm only 3 years out, so I wasn't a doc student that far long ago, we are constantly in journals. And some journals are more practically oriented, and some journals are more theoretically oriented. And so we as academics can get really excited by a very particular nuanced research question. And it's our job to generalize that research question in a way that a manager or a policymaker can say, okay, yes, that's a question that I can find value in for my donors, for my customers or whatnot. And how can you make that something that a manager can get excited about? And so one thing that I really want to focus on is this notion of behavioral outcomes. I lost a partnership with a major blood center because I said, oh, I have some preliminary data that says that this can increase your donors' intentions to donate in the future. And it was a hard stop because organizations don't care about intentions. They care about actions and behaviors. And so if you're, let's say, more CB oriented, or if you're doing some sort of experiments, or if you're limited by secondary data that has intention-based data, figure out how you can translate that into action when you're talking or pitching your idea to an organization, because as soon as you say intention, you're going to lose them, because organizations know that donors or customers oftentimes say they're going to do something, but then they don't follow through. So that's just something really to be cognizant about that you might not be aware of, especially depending on the level of journal that you're trying to target. So how do you generate relevant ideas? So this was actually the first essay of my dissertation. It's now in the process at JMR. But what we found is that organizations were spending a whole bunch of money on giving their employees free food. But why were they doing it? And so by talking to companies, and what we found is that by giving employees free food, it makes them feel valued. They ultimately treat the customers better, and then customers spend more money above and beyond the cost that goes into that free food. And so for this particular paper, we worked with a Swedish grocery store. And what was unique about grocery stores is we were able to basically pitch this idea. For a grocery store, their food, and this isn't in the paper, but their food expires at a certain point. And so they're going to throw that food away. And so our pitch to this grocery store was, if you take this food and instead of throwing it away, what we think, and we can perhaps show this to you if you want to work with us, if you take this nearly expired food and you give it to your employees, they might actually treat your grocery customers better. And because of that experience, your customers might spend more money. And the manager was like, oh my gosh, it won't cost me anything, and perhaps my customers can spend more money. That was directly relevant to that grocery store. They let us do some field studies, and then it turned into a paper. So I'll go into more detail about how you kind of do this specifically, but this is kind of holistically what this path might look forward, from idea generation to working with a company to ultimately getting a paper out of it. I just have a quick slide here. For those of you that are more interested in like societally oriented work, I'm oftentimes going to say manager, but there are a whole bunch of non-managerial stakeholders that journals care about, specifically when it comes to government and non-governmental organizations and institutions. This is a paper that's in the works at JAMS right now, that basically, if you're more societally focused, a lot of the things that I am saying can oftentimes apply to nonprofits or governmental organizations as well. So this is a kind of a broad, encompassing perspective, in my opinion. So your first question might be, okay, first I have to find a company to work with. So how do I do that? So these are all from my own experiences, kind of hands on the ground as a doc student. So specifically in your area, compared to large organizations, small businesses are way more likely to work with you. They have less resources. They want to help. They're small. And as the business gets bigger and bigger and bigger, they have their own ecosystem, they have their own norms, and it's hard to break into that. So in my experience, what I found, especially starting out, is that identifying a small versus a large business tends to be much more beneficial, especially because larger businesses or organizations tend to have a legal area or like a legal department. And as soon as they have a legal department, your job of getting their data is basically zero. So it would be great if you could work with a Google or a Nike or an Alphabet or a Meta or whoever, but those organizations tend to be so large that as a doc student, you don't have the name recognition or the expertise to kind of mitigate the potential legal consequences that that organization could face from working with you. In addition to small businesses, locally owned businesses are the way to go. 80% of all of my company partnerships have been locally owned businesses in the area that I've worked with. If you think about it, the university where you are tends to have a large presence in your community. So for example, in Tallahassee, FSU is one of the three colleges here. People know FSU and they want to help FSU. And so by working with companies or identifying companies that have a tie to your community, it's a way for the owners to give back. And so by identifying, let's say, a small business that may be locally owned, you already have a leg up to a company that may not have a connection to your community. And then the third are alumni owners. If you think about the school that you graduated from for any of your prior degrees, you oftentimes had a favorable experience. And if there was a way for you to help them without just giving them money, you oftentimes might be more willing to do that. And I found huge success with that. One of the projects that I'll talk about, it was the second essay of my dissertation. It was a locally owned small business where the owner, she graduated from the University of Tennessee where I did my PhD. And I said, oh, I'm getting my PhD. I need some data. And we just got to talking. And because I was a student at Tennessee and she graduated from Tennessee, she was like, whatever you need, I can help you with. But how do you find alumni-owned businesses? So most schools or most colleges or universities have these alumni events. They're typically these super boring dinners where people will go and they'll talk for hours about all the great things that they did, yada, yada, yada. But you'll be put at a table with 9 different people and you'll be sitting there for perhaps 2-3 hours. That forces you into a table with existing alumni that oftentimes have excelled in their own career. And that's how you can get your foot in the door. You want to put yourself in circumstances where you'll be surrounded by people who can help you. And so find these alumni events that your school hosts and ask if you can have a seat at the table. And oftentimes they're clamoring for faculty or doc students to represent the college at these alumni events. So they'll be very, very willing oftentimes to kind of get your seat at that table. And so nonprofits are my bread and butter. Typically, nonprofits have smaller operating budgets. They don't have a marketing department. They don't have the ability to work with consultants. And so nonprofits, I found, have way more data than they know what to do with. And they have data that they don't even know that they have. So for example, this is just a data poll that I got last week from one of the blood centers that I work with. And for this project, we were interested in how blood type influences donations. So really, for my purpose, all I needed was blood type, and then of course the donor ID and the donation ID. But then I found out they also had so much more rich data. I knew where they donated, the date, what they donated, where they donated, the actual employee that checked them in, when the needle went in their arm, when the needle went out their arm. And so from a researcher perspective, I'm salivating. I'm like, okay, I can make 4 potential A-level projects just from this data set that this blood center didn't even know that they had. And so by working with nonprofits, they may or may not even have a CRM system. And even if it's, a handwriting, here's your check-in thing, they probably keep them. And so if you can collect what they have and be scrappy about it, nonprofits really are the way to go, because you're offering them value. And I'll talk about how to communicate your value to these companies shortly. But by you saying, I can help you, it opens up a huge doorway that nonprofits are much more receptive to than typically for-profit organizations. So now that, let's say you found a small local nonprofit that has someone in the executive level that graduated from your institution, and they say, yeah, I might want to work with you. Now what? How do you get them from interested to actually giving you data, letting you do a field experiment or a donor survey if you're more CB oriented, or giving you their secondary data for some of the more quant oriented people? How can you actually do that? So these are all strategies that I started doing as a doc student that I still use to this day. When I was reading your questions, a lot of the time you guys wanted like actionable, what do I need to do? And so here's 6 things that I have actively learned can help kind of translate interest into behavior from a company wanting to work with you. And the first is, especially as a doc student, you work with so many experts in your field, you realize how little you know, and it's very intimidating because you're in an environment where you're the low person on the totem pole. You're the doc student, you're working with faculty, you feel like you're disposable. But that's what companies think about you. Most people have no idea that a PhD in business is even a thing. And as soon as you say that you're getting a PhD, people automatically assume that you're way more intelligent than they am, and you're way more apt than they are. And so you need to channel that confidence and realize that based on your training, you can help these companies. Only 2% of people in the world globally have a PhD level education. So you are more educated than 98% of the people in the world. And so you need to harness that when you're communicating with companies. It sounds cliche, but confidence really is key when you're pitching your ideas to these companies. And a way that you can do that, what I found is some companies are kind of hesitant. Why do you want to work with me? What are you getting out of it? Because I mean, if you're reaching out to them, clearly you have some foot in the game. And so let's say if some suspicion runs in, how can you mitigate that? And so what I found is accreditation standards are your friend. And that's because most people have heard of accreditation bodies like AACSB or EQUIS or AMBA, but they really don't know what it is. And so you can say, oh, have you heard of AACSB or EQUIS? I'm getting my PhD from one of these schools. And if you look, part of the accreditation body, what they say, and I'll reference is, I'll just pull up this picture and I'll say, okay, so one of my job as teaching at a business school is I have to provide relevant knowledge and skills to the communities that I serve. And so what I get out of it is when it comes to my annual evaluation, I have to show that I'm doing work that matters to businesses. And I'm here to give that to you. I basically give you free consulting, and then I get to go to my department chair or my dean or my dissertation advisor and say, I'm actually helping the community. And so by leveraging the simple fact that you're at an accredited school can help you talk to companies and say, this is why I want to work with you. Not because I need to, but because I have to. And then they're like, oh, okay, I've been evaluated before. I get how that works. And it helps break down some of those barriers. And I kind of mentioned this, position yourself as a consultant. Hey, I need to help you. Whatever questions you have, I can help you get there. And that helps say, okay, what are you giving to this particular organization that they can't do themselves? And based on some of the questions that you guys asked, it selfishly kind of needs to be, but it's, how do I get a company to care about what I care about? That, in my experience, should be the second step. They are giving you something super valuable, their time, their data, the ability to run studies, experiments, get secondary data, quasi-experiments, whatever it is. You should start by asking them, what do they want? So for example, one of the blood centers I've worked with, what they wanted, so some background, sickle cell anemia, it might be a disease that some of you have ever heard of. It disproportionately affects individuals of African and Hispanic ancestry. So for example, 90% of all individuals with sickle cell are Black. And I say Black versus African American because we're talking about the biological factor of race versus ethnicity. And so they need blood donors specifically that are Black to treat sickle cell patients who themselves are Black. And so what they came to me and said is, okay, how can we get more Black donors? And I said, okay, I will figure that out. And so what I didn't realize at the time is that blood centers are nonprofits. And so they sell blood to hospitals on a cost recovery basis. And so certain blood types actually sell for more than others on the marketplace. And I was like, that's the marketing angle. Here's where the money comes in. And what I found is that Black donors on average are individuals that come from the African region of the globe based on genetic factors are more likely to have type O negative blood. And so the paper, it's now a revision at JM, but what we were able to say by working with this company is they wanted more Black blood donors. And what I said was, it's great for society to have more equitable healthcare access, but it can also make you more money. And so, oh, it's a win-win. It wins me. I get a paper out of it. It wins for society. More Black blood donors have equitable healthcare access, and it also can make you more money. So by starting with something that the company wants, that was my nugget for starting the paper, and then it kind of went from there. And then another thing, because I work with a lot of healthcare data, is NDAs. I was petrified. I had no experience with an NDA. A company presented me with a document to sign and said, you can never talk about this data. But then I went to the journals and I'm like, oh no, I have to submit my data. How do I get past this? Well, don't be scared by an NDA. In fact, they can be leveraged as something that can help you. So this is, for example, all AMA journals, they're receptive to NDAs. There's ways of getting around NDAs by transforming the data and whatnot when you submit it to a journal. So don't be scared about that. But what I found is you can come with the idea of an NDA, and it makes companies much more comfortable. So for example, if you went to a company and said, hey, I want to work with you, I know you might be scared, I'm happy to sign an NDA so you know that I'm not stealing some of your business secrets. I'm just here to generate knowledge and publish in journals. And so you yourself, by presenting them with the option of an NDA, can increase your likelihood of converting them from an interested partner to a partner that's actually engaging with you. And then the last thing that I found by working with companies is not something that I would ever have thought. As a doc student, for a company to give me data, I thought they are the holy grail. They are giving me something that can make my career. Well, what I found is because they knew that I was getting a PhD and they had the perception that I was an expert and I was working with Google and Alphabet and Facebook and Meta and yada, 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 they assumed that I was working with companies, even though I wasn't at the time, that were way more prestigious than they are. And they were in fact concerned and embarrassed that the data they were going to give to me wasn't going to be of the quality that I needed or structured in the way that I could use, and so I actually lost a company. I was able to reconvert them, but they said, oh, I don't think that we're going to be able to give you the data in a format that will be usable for you. And I said, no. Give me any data that you have, and I can format it, and I can make this work. So something that they might not be saying, especially when you're working with a small mom and pop or a locally owned business, is they probably may be embarrassed that they aren't going to be able to help you even if they want to. And so by minimizing some of these unspoken concerns it can help convert, again, an interested party into a party that can actually help you. And so at the end of the day, realistically, they're giving you something that's more valuable than what you're giving them. Like an A-level paper or a paper at whatever tier of journal is going to help you. This is what our career is for. And so the first blood center that I worked with, this is from a field data collection in my third dissertation essay, they were interested in signage. And how can their billboards or their signage get people in the door? And so I was like, okay, I know how to design a survey in Qualtrics. They had never heard of Qualtrics. They have an existing donor base. And I said, okay, you know, at the time I was a PhD student, so I kind of faked it. And I said, I'm an expert in marketing. I have a lot of experience in designing surveys and analyzing customer data, t-tests, means. And I said, okay, if you let me, I'll design a survey for you if you let me send it out to your donors and I can answer your questions. And so the first 5, 6 questions were the questions that they wanted. And then I asked the 20 questions that I wanted to right after that. And so I got a data set, a real data set from donors that I was able to match to their blood donation behaviors. And all I had to do was calculate means and send it to them the next day and go, here's the average donor's perception of your billboard or your signage or whatever. And then I had this glorious data set that I was able to use. And now this is a 4th round at JM. Hopefully these papers start converting. So by making sure that you can answer their questions, make it a win-win. But the focus should always be starting with what they want. Because once I came back and I answered their questions, whenever they have another question, they reach out to me now and go, hey, they have 30,000 donors. And they go, can you help us answer this very simple question that can be answered with a meme? I can do this in 5 seconds. And they're going to allow me to send out a survey to 30,000 people, and then I can match that to actual behavioral data. Oh my gosh, it's made my career. So by starting with what they want and proving your value to them, it increases the likelihood of kind of making this relationship go in the long term. Okay, so some of the questions were really interesting, but I want us to really, the kind of goal of this talk is working with real companies. Realize that these are real businesses with real employees and real customers. And as soon as a company gives you access to doing anything with them, you have a lot of power to screw up their business. And so you need to make sure that you're not being overly ambitious with what you're trying to do. And so I'll give you an example. I have a co-author who is phenomenal. They are extremely prolific at A-levels. They're pumping out A-level hits like it's candy. I want to be this person when I grow up. They have a lot of experience publishing, but not necessarily working with companies. And so sometimes what a journal cares about, a company doesn't necessarily care about. And so we had one of these surveys right here that I was able to get access done. And what this person wanted me to ask was donors' perceptions on abortion. Okay, it's an important topic, especially in the academic realm, but could you imagine if I sent out a survey to 30,000 customers in an organization and I asked about abortion? Their customers would revolt. So I had to go back and say, no, there's no way that this company is going to allow me to ask their donors about their perspectives about abortion. Why on earth would a blood center want to know that? And so you really need to be careful that the things that you're asking about are safe, basically, because had I added that to the survey, there would have been a revolt for this company, and that would have been the end of that working relationship. So just because it can be theoretically interesting, or a journal might think it is a nice contribution, you need to be very cognizant of the practicality of going from writing a paper to working with a business. And that came from, I think, 2 of the questions that were asking things. And I was like, you probably wouldn't want to do that with an actual company because there could be negative ramifications. So that's just an example of something that I experienced in the past. So I'll give you a little walkthrough to my own experiences of how this works. I love drinking. As you can see here, I think it's super fun. And so this is a story of a paper that was invited for a resubmission at JM that actually came from a locally owned business that was opened by a woman who graduated from the University of Tennessee. So I was at a bar, and it was a really cool bar in Knoxville, Tennessee. And instead of a bartender, a frontline employee for my research interest, they had these digital displays and they had this wristband. And instead of asking a bartender, what do you want to drink? You would go up, read about a beverage, a wine or a beer, physically tap your arm to this digital display, and then pour it out. And I was like, oh, wow, this is a really cool context for a research project. And so I just went up to the checkout cashier and I said, can I get the information for the owner? I think this is really interesting from a research perspective. And so I was overly ambitious. This is one of the first companies I worked with. This was my second dissertation essay. And I was like, do you collect data on the beverages that your consumers are choosing after reading these products? Because there's a physical tap, maybe they're able to link it. And they said, oh yeah, we have data on everything. So now I'm salivating and I'm like, oh wow, this is super awesome. Can you, give me some of your data files? And they go, oh, we don't really have data files. All we have are receipts. So what I was interested in, just to give you some background for this project, is reading the description of one product. How does that influence your evaluation or your consumption of a second product, and then subsequently a third product into infinity? And because the consumers themselves are choosing these beverages, how does reordering these product descriptions influence alcohol consumption? So what this wonderful company did, I still am forever grateful for them, is they gave me bags and bags and bags of receipts. And so I spent 2 months of my summer as a doc student coding up all of these receipts. And so I say this because I now have a resubmission at JM because of it. This can be overwhelming, but you need to meet these companies where they are. They may not have the data. That's where the data of embarrassment comes into play. They thought they weren't able to work with me, but I said, no, I have no life. I'm a PhD student. I will meet you halfway. And so based on these receipts, I now have information on the number of beverages that an individual tried or sampled, the order that they purchased things in, how much in ounces they consumed, how much they spend, so on and so forth. So every company that you can think of has a receipt. So if you can find a company that's willing to work with you, if you just say, if you can give me your receipts, I can make this work. And you really can, because there's a lot of information on receipts. And as long as you have the ability to code things manually, you can make this work. And then once you get experience working with companies, you can leverage that to work with more powerful companies and just kind of keep crawling up the ladder. And I'll show you how to do that kind of towards the end of the presentation. I'll kind of skip this one just for purposes of time. And so, I mean, I now am faculty at a pretty good university, and so it might seem like, oh yeah, I'm the expert. I know exactly what I'm doing. I make mistakes all the time. I'm still learning with this, and this is an example of what could have been the worst mistake I have ever made with one of the blood centers I worked with. So I have a paper where I wanted to look at how what we do online influences our behaviors offline. And so I wanted to see, as we get involved in social media online, does that influence how we engage in the offline world? Well, it's really hard to manipulate social media use. And so I was speaking with the CEO of one of the blood centers, and I said, what tools do you have? And I'll be creative. And they said, well, we have this software. It's pretty rudimentary, but we can send text messages to donors. And so I was like, oh, perfect. Can I randomly assign certain donors to get one text message versus the other? And he said, yes. I said, okay, I can make a field experiment out of this. And so what we did is we randomly assigned 15,000 people to receive one of 3 text messages, or the company randomly assigned people, where it was either they got nothing, a social media present, or social media absent. And so what we did is they were able to give us data afterward on the people matched with their donor ID and their condition. If after receiving one of their respective text messages, did they come and actually donate over the study period? And I analyzed the data, and by some grace of God, it worked. My 15,000 person field experiment with behavioral data worked. The high social media condition had lower donations than the non-social media condition. And I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be my JM. This is going to be my first one. So then I go to write up the paper and I'm doing my tests, and I realize that the conditions weren't in fact randomly assigned. What the Blood Center did is they just filtered 15,000 donors based on their name from ascending order in Excel. And what happened is certain people of certain age groups, think of Ethel or Miriam, older names tend to be clustered together. And so certain ages were actually clustered in one condition versus the other. And so this beautiful 15,000 person field experiment that worked, I cannot use because the conditions weren't in fact randomly assigned. And that just is an example of how things that we take for granted, random assignment, these companies may not know. So even basic things that you think may be given, you want to hold these companies' hands, because things that matter for us, random assignment for a journal, if you're more experimental, don't matter for companies. They don't care about random assignment. So thankfully, I had an existing relationship with this company. They let me do it again. They gave me access to their system. I ensured random assignment. And thankfully, this experiment replicated, the field experiment replicated. But this just goes to show how things totally unexpected when working with real companies can actually go harm. So then the last few things I want to talk about are this idea of disseminating your research, because by building your name in a particular area, and I started this as a doc student, so don't think that you're too young in your career to do this. By getting known in a field, more companies will want to work with you, and then it fosters a very wonderfully cyclical relationship. I hated LinkedIn. All I have is Facebook for my own social media. I don't have Instagram or anything, or TikTok. I do social media research, and I find it icky, and so I never wanted LinkedIn. But because I work with companies, I realized I had to have a LinkedIn presence by establishing myself or making people think at least I'm an expert in a particular area. It makes them have a halo effect of expertise on me, and now I have companies reaching out to work with me. And so by really building a presence, and I'll show you how to do that, you can get to the point of, instead of you eventually in your career reaching out to companies, you'll find that companies are reaching out to you. And it's a really great place to be if you can do this strategically. So I actually did this my first semester as a doc student. And if you think back to your first semester, maybe some of you are first semester doc students, you know literally nothing. You don't know what you don't know. And so you may be floundering, at least I was floundering. And so I actually saw an advertisement for this organization called SCORE. And so if you're in the US, you probably have a SCORE near you. So this will be a perfect place for you to just Google and start. And there's probably a similar organization for other places, Europe or Asia, because it's kind of like a nonprofit. So what this is, it's a whole bunch of retired executives that have retired. They realize that they're kind of bored. And so what they want to do is work with upcoming businesses, local mom and pops, to help build their company. So at the time, it stood for Service Corps of Retired Executives. So it's a whole bunch of old people, old seniors that have retired, who have a whole bunch of connections. And so what I did is I just emailed them. I pretended to be an expert, and I said, hey, I'm a PhD student getting a PhD in marketing, and I'd love to speak to you guys about things that I think are important in the field. And at the time, I just Googled important future of marketing. And I gave them a 15-minute presentation. Some of these executives thought it was interesting. I started working with local mom and pops. I eventually, this is more recent, but I then started getting invited to do webinars just based on word of mouth. I eventually got invited up to DC to speak in front of 150 CEOs and public policymakers. Based on that, I now somehow, I'm just Riley, but I'm somehow becoming keynote speakers. But this started by a local nonprofit. I needed to literally cold call, sending them an email, being like, hey, I want to help you and I want to work with you. And I did this as a first semester doc student with nothing to my name. And so if I could do it as a first semester doc student with no experience, you can too. Because remember, by nature of getting a PhD, you are more educated than 98% of the people in the world. And so you need to harness that and use that. And you can do that right now. Again, social media, LinkedIn's great. This is from a few months ago. It was a marketing expert. I have his name blocked off just to so you guys don't, or just to protect his, information. But now I have another connection that's based on one of my LinkedIn posts that, oh, my organization is also struggling with this. Can we work together? Of course we can. What data do you have? Also, if you're interested in more societally oriented stuff, your university oftentimes is a great place to start. They want to advertise any success that you have, or at least in the US system, for bills as they're kind of being considered in the US governmental model, they're oftentimes open to what we call a public commentary period. And what it is any member of the public can write their opinion on the potential impacts of a law. And so if you find a law that might have a relation to some research area that you yourself are engaged in, start commenting on these public processes. And maybe a governmental aide will see your comment and reach out to you. Because if you are trying to establish yourself as, for example, me, an expert in blood donation strategy, and there's a new law coming out on how do we do whatever with blood donations, I can comment on this, and they might eventually reach out to me. And so here's just another actionable strategy that you can start doing yourself, because there's no barrier to entry. You can just do this now. As long as you're a citizen, at least of the US, for the US model, you can start engaging in this process. And so I hope I answered a lot of the questions here, but I think there's now some time where I can answer more specific questions. I really much am an open book. I'll give you my frank perspective of what did or did not work. I failed way more than I succeeded, so I've learned a lot about things, what to do and what not to do.
Thank you, Professor. That was very, very insightful. I did compile a list of questions which were I thought were important from the list that we got, but
yeah,
I guess you have answered almost all of them. So a few of, one question which even I thought could be important here would be like, what is the unique advantage of field data compared to online panels? Like we have Amazon, MTurk or Qualtrics, and how do you think that, what are the main advantages?
That is a great question. So I'm going to take this from a very practical perspective. We're in the field of publishing research, and so the journals themselves want field data. And so we need to meet the journals where they are. And that oftentimes get at that intention behavior gap. There's so much literature that shows that there's a huge gap between what people say they do, between what people say they do and what they're actually going to do. And so for anyone that does experimental work, you're oftentimes taught to make your DD behavioral if possible. So you might measure time on page or give them some sort of task to make it more behavioral, but they're still, well, it's not the real world. So it might have high internal validity, but as an applied discipline being business, especially your more applied journals like your JM or your JAMS or your JMR to an extent, they want to know that what you're saying works in the real world. And so the same paper, all else being equal, using a prolific panel data or a field data set, that field data set is going to be the one that gets the revision.
Yeah, that's true, bro. I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, it's hard, and it is hard. That's why I was like, okay, how can I start working with companies as early as possible? Because I was in a program, it was like, if you don't publish A's, you're worthless. So I was like, oh crap, how do I do this? So I was in a high pressure circumstance, and so I was, for better or worse, kind of forced into that.
True. Okay, so one more question that we got was on how can we enhance the reliability and accuracy of the field data collection? So, any comments on that?
Correct. So as long as you do what you're taught in a field setting, you should be fine. So, and I'll kind of answer this question two ways. So for example, random assignment. That field experiment that I showed, that would have never flown through the revision process because fundamentally there was a flaw in the experimental design because it wasn't randomly assigned. So by applying the skills that you've learned in your PhD program, don't use single item measures if possible. Use multi-item measures, or make your proxy for behavior as akin to the actual behavior itself if possible. But one of the benefits that I found of field data versus experiments is most reviewers and journal editors and AEs understand that getting a company to work with you is hard. And so they're willing to accept less perfect field data as long as it's not wrong versus an experiment that you're doing online, Qualtrics or Prolific or MTurk or Cloud Research. That has to be perfect because it's not hard to rerun an experiment and make a change. And so when you're submitting to a journal, they say, okay, you're submitting an experiment that you had full control over if, let's say, you're using an online panel. So why didn't you do that perfectly? But if you're working with a company, most journal editors know that, okay, there are fundamental limitations because this is a real business. So they're willing to accept, I don't want to say worse data, but it doesn't have to be perfect as long as it's not wrong. And so the threshold of let's say accuracy or perfection that you may see in a journal, at least in my experience, is lower for field data than non-field data. So that's one of the benefits, again, from a practical publishing perspective of field data. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think Julia is receiving some chat questions. Julia, you can take it off from here.
Wonderful. So yeah, I've been monitoring the chat. We had a couple of great questions. Riley, here's one that actually ties into the publication topic. Someone asked, it seems like many of your projects started with observing a phenomenon, for example, the alcohol tap to purchase device. How do you turn these phenomena into theoretically novel research questions?
Okay, that's great. So when you're publishing a paper, there are multiple avenues to contribution. And so in an ideal world, a paper will have all three. You can contribute to theory, you can contribute to methodology, or you can contribute to a substantive phenomenon. And that's where I find most of my research is a substantive contribution. I see a problem and I want to fix it. And by speaking to managers or just observing what's happening or just reading, I consume the news like it's candy, or HBR. If there's a problem out there, that means that somebody needs to fix it. And assuming that a quick Google Scholar search will see if there's anything published on that, that's kind of where I go. I live in the world, and so I just look at things around me and I go, now that I'm experienced in kind of how the publishing process works, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I don't think I've seen a paper on that. Would a business manager care about this? And now I'm in a position just based on experience where I have a lot of senior executives that I work with, and I can just send them a text or an email and say, hey, would you care about this? And then they say no. So that's where that 1JM on how to increase donations among Black blood donors specifically came into play. And they're like, hey, this is a problem. And I'm like, okay, the journals care about equitable healthcare access. I do, and a manager does. Cool, let's make a paper out of it.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. So we have another question here. So as you know, DocSIG is a loving space for everyone, CB researchers, empirical modelers,
Yeah.
but also strategy researchers. And so we got a question from the strategy realm. And so someone is asking, any specific insights on collecting data in the B2B space?
Yes. So I actually just learned this recently. So for that one project, I've already talked about increasing donations among Black blood donors specifically because it has the potential to save a specific subset of the population's lives, those with sickle cell anemia. So I assumed, I just assumed that blood centers were just a typical nonprofit. But based on US regulations, blood centers are actually codified as a manufacturer. And then I found that blood centers sell the blood to hospitals on a cost recovery basis. That's where that chart came into play. So from a B2B perspective, one of my working papers now is looking at that relationship between from firm to firm, the interaction between a blood center and a hospital. So how does that interaction take place? So even if you're like, I swear by nonprofits just because they're more willing to work with you. Oftentimes nonprofits themselves collect donations from other businesses. So most nonprofits actually have interactions with other businesses themselves. And so if you are able to secure a relationship with a nonprofit, you can look at their interactions from the business to business space. And so that would be an opportunity for you to kind of leverage what I talked about specifically here in a B2B space, just being creative with the questions that you have, or in, let's say, an empirics first approach, see what data they have, and then see what constructs or variables might be able to match onto what your research interests on. And as long as you're not very specific, I'm only interested in how X influences Y in this particular context, that really limits you. As long as you're more interested in an area itself, you really can find creative ways to answer your questions.
Oh, thank you for that one. I think I have two more questions, and I think the next one is a very short one, but somebody was asking about power, actually. So what is the number of data points one needs before journals consider one's paper seriously?
Okay, that is a great question. So I have a friend that just got a revision at an A-level journal. I'm trying not to like identify anyone. A friend that's got a revision at an A-level journal, and they were very concerned because they were able to work with a company, but it was a very small company. And this company allowed them to do a field experiment. And the field experiment was about 87 people. So about 43 people per cell. And they were very nervous that the journal was, because it's an A, was going to be like, no, this isn't sufficient. But because it was a real company with real behaviors, they didn't even ask for more samples. Like most of the time, especially at A-level, they want you to redo all your studies. Fine, it's the name of the game. This one study, from a power perspective, the weakest power study in their paper is the only one that the editor wants to keep because it was a real company with real data. So it could depend on the editor, but the threshold for power when you're working with a company is significantly lower because they realize it's most people don't have access to doing a 15,000 person field experiment. It would be asinine for a journal editor to ask that. And most editors realize that. And so again, the threshold of expectation is lower for field data.
That's an excellent answer. And so it actually leads me to one of the biggest things in a PhD life, and that is failure. So our very last question is about, what if I propose that there is no effect from the field data? Will the company be disappointed, as in, I didn't help them at all? What's your experience with that?
That is a good question. Let me think about how to answer that. I think it really just depends on the relationship to the company that you have. And this is, again, more personality than anything. I would say we're in the business of marketing. And so you need to realize it's probably impossible to publish a null effect at an A-level journal. I can't recall a paper recently that's done that. But managers themselves aren't journal editors, and so they're more receptive to null effects. So if you came back and just said, I didn't find an effect, yeah, they might probably think it is a waste of time. But if you marketed yourself and you position that as, interestingly, we thought this was going to be an effect, but it wasn't. And so because of that, that makes X, Y, and Z more likely. And so now I think that Y could be the reason why. And so if you're the only company, because of this null effect, that is first to the market to find out that Y has an effect, you can increase your market share, or you can get more donations, or you can get more sales. And so you can just position, like you could position the front end of a paper, position that null effect into a next step. I've done that, not with the null effect, but I positioned effects that I thought, oh crap, this isn't what I wanted, to just, oh, here, this is how we can go to the next step. And so you just want to make that company connection hungry for the next thing.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Riley. And if everyone could agree in just clapping your hands with the Zoom tool, that would be awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your time today. And we hope that everyone found today's session insightful and valuable. Riley, thanks for showing us the ropes, and everyone who asked questions, thank you for making the session more valuable. I also want to thank Amir and Zhao Ying from our special projects team. We are all doc students who are volunteering their time to create value in our doctoral student community. In the chat, you can see further opportunities to connect with us. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out at any point in time. We wish you a wonderful Black Friday. And Riley, again, thank you. If you have any parting thoughts, the floor is yours.
I would say thank you guys for having me. I'm happy to give back to an organization that has given me so much. And if you guys have any questions, just shoot me an email. It's my first name, last name, riley.krotz@fsu.edu. I answer questions from students that I've never met all the time. People reach out to me. I'm happy to do that. I want to create a culture where we can all help each other. So if you have any specific questions that I wasn't able to answer, literally shoot me an email and I will reply. So I'm happy to help.
Thank you, Riley.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.